The subject of today's class is the Atlantic world comes to North America. We're going to talk really primarily about a thing that historians call the Columbian Exchange, but also about the meaning of the Atlantic world. To start off with, the Atlantic world is something that scholars tend to use to describe early North American history. That moment when European empire arrives and kind of connects North America and indigenous peoples in North America to the world of empire in Europe, but also to the world of Africa and to the trade that circulates between European colonies in the Americas, the Caribbean, North America, South America, Africa, and Europe. Um, the particular subject of today's discussion will be New England and the contact between the New England Indians and the English colonists who we think of as pilgrims. Now, the pilgrims were actually on their way to Virginia Colony, you can see here in the Americas, but they are blown off course and they arrive at Plymouth and establish very quickly a relationship with the Wampanoag Indians, who are the inhabitants of Plymouth College. And that relationship is mostly enshrined in the relationship with Squanto, or Tisquantum, as he's known in Wampanoag. Now, if I asked you who Squanto was, I'm willing to bet that all of you can conjure up some image or idea in your head about Squanto and that relationship with the Pilgrims. And it probably goes something like this. Squanto finds the Pilgrims, sort of in poor shape, starving on Plymouth Rock, and basically shows them how to live in North America, how to plant corn, how to survive in North America. He helps befriend the English colonists, introducing them to his people, the Wampanoag, and creating up the basis for a treaty relationship, or at least an alliance of some sorts, that allows the English at Plymouth Colony to survive their first few winters and eventually to start to thrive. Now, I know you have some version of that story in your head, and what I want to do is pause here and ask you, what is the significance of that story? And I think, if you think about it, it does a couple of things. One, it works on an ideological level. What's the lesson of Squanto? This is a sort of mythological or ideological way in which Americans can justify their arrival and really ultimately the dispossession of native peoples. You have a native helper, somebody who shows you, in effect, how to become American yourself. That's the kind of ideological work that the Squanto story does, and probably one of the reasons why it circulates so widely and why we all have heard it at one point or another. But the other thing that this does is it allows us to think about the actual story of Squanto. And that actual story tells us a lot about early contact in the New World and about what it means for the Atlantic world to come to North America. Now, specifically, this is getting us into a discussion of the Columbian Exchange. That is, the sort of exchange of people's things, microbes, and ideas between Europe and the Americas. And this starts out with a quick story about who um, Squantum was in reality. He was a Wampanoag, as I've mentioned. He comes from the village of Pokanoket. At around the time that he of contact, or shortly before the arrival of Europeans, the Wampanoag were a village community, multiple villages, each village being around 2,000 people, and there being somewhere in the neighborhood of 10 to 15 villages for a total of 20 to 25,000 people. Actually, I'm sorry, that's not right. Up to 40 villages, ranging in size from a few hundred people to 1,500, and for a total of about 20 to 2,500 people living in what we now think of as the Massachusetts area. Now, the fur trade has put the Wampanoag into contact with Europeans long before the arrival of the English colonists. In fact, there are French traders and there are English traders that coast up and down the northern shorelines from what we now think of as Nova Scotia through Maine, Massachusetts, and New Hampshire, and they're trading in and along the river valleys that empty out into the seacoast with largely the Abenaki Indians who inhabit this region and who do a lot of hunting and have really valuable furs. So the trade is largely in furs with English sailors who are both coming up from colonies in the Caribbean and also coasting from the north to south through the fisheries that off the coast of Nova Scotia, and they're trading with indigenous people for well over a century before the English arrive. So that this isn't a first contact situation when the Pilgrims arrive. It is, in fact, a long-standing relationship that Native peoples and Europeans have put together centered on the fur trade. Now, the fur trade itself is a sort of elaboration of Native subsistence patterns. As I said, in the north, where it's harder to grow crops, you have more reliance on seasonal hunting, fish runs, things like that. In the New England area, you actually end up having an agricultural or horticultural based economy where native peoples focus on growing crops, specifically corn, beans, and squash. Now, at the time that Pocahontas comes into contact with Europeans, he actually meets up with John Smith of Pocahontas fame, who's coming up from Virginia Colony on his way back to the Europe and is trying to find the last few bits of valuable things he can before he heads back. He ends up not only trading for furs along the seacoast, but also taking Squanto and a number of other Indians captive. Thus, we have Squanto traveling to Europe, where he spends several years, first in Spain, then in English. In England, he learns to speak English, and he eventually makes his way back to North America in the New World in the company of English traders who want to establish a colony in North America. And they thought that their best bet is to take Squanto, who now speaks both the indigenous language of the region and English, back to the New World with them. Things don't work out for the English on this trip, but they do work out for Squanto. However, when he returns to his home territory, he finds that it has been devastated by disease. This is another important factor in thinking about the Atlantic world, and it's called virgin soil epidemics. As I mentioned in the last class, there are no draft animals in North America, and relationships between human and animals ends up being one of the more important ways that disease travels between human and animal communities. Well, the arrival of so many diseases, both from Europeans and from their animals, that native peoples had not been exposed to, result in wide-scale disease that has a devastating impact on native populations, reducing the Wampanoag population by well over 50%, so that by the time Squanto returns after several years away, he finds that the Pokanoket village that he once belonged to is no longer in existence. Thus, he returns to a Wampanoag community that has been radically reconfigured. As I said, almost 40 different villages. They've been reduced, I believe, by more than half. They are also now finding themselves not only weaker because there are fewer people, they're finding social relations scrambled because their villages have shrunk, they've lost large numbers of people, and they're finding themselves encroached on by the Narragansetts. These are the people to the west of what would now be the Massachusetts Bay colony, and the Narragansetts are beginning to ask for tribute to the Wampanoag and to put pressure on them by encroaching on their territory. So when Squanto returns home, he returns home to a political situation where the Wampanoag are sort of reeling. They've lost power, they've lost territory, and along come the English settlers, who at least ostensibly believe that they are immigrating to North America to help Indian people. Here's a Massachusetts Bay colony seal, where the Indians saying, "Come over and help us." This does not turn out to be something that works. Here's a picture of the coastline, and you can see down here to Long Island, up here to what would now be Massachusetts, the Narragansett inhabit this territory. They have contact with the Dutch, who are operating out of Long Island and what would now be the mouth of the Hudson River. So they have access to Europeans and European trade goods. And what Squanto represents for the Wampanoag is an opportunity to create a relationship with the English. Massasoit is a Wampanoag leader who enlists the help of Squanto to begin a relationship with the newly arrived English people. And that relationship is one that he thinks of as a counterweight to the relationship the Narragansett have with Dutch traders. So what might be seen as something of a point of resistance, that is, native peoples resisting the arrival of new peoples in their lands, actually looks to the Wampanoag like an opportunity. They've been decimated by disease, they've lost a lot of numbers, they've lost territory, and the English represent opportunity because they bring with them trade goods that are valuable, an ally that might be militarily capable, and through forging a relationship with the English, people we think of as the Pilgrims, Massasoit using Squanto as an interpreter, we end up having one of the first treaties between English-speaking peoples and Native Americans. That treaty relationship allows the English a place in native North America and becomes the seed of an alliance relationship that will last for years, but ultimately will suffer because the types of relationships that native peoples, Wampanoag here specifically, and the English have with the land is very different. The English interpret their treaty as having sold them the right to the land. The natives interpret their treaty as having allowed English people the privilege of living on their territory. And this gets us to other important factors. The seasonal round of native peoples. I'm scrolling through a number of pictures of alewives, salmon, smelt, sturgeon, salmon again. All these fish are going to go through seasonal runs that course through the rivers that empty into Massachusetts Bay Colony. At different times of the year, native people will move across the landscape, harvesting fish and other seasonal resources like berries, but they also have, as I mentioned, extensive agricultural settlements. They farm the Three Sisters, corn, beans, and squash. And they farm them in such a way that they don't need lots of attendants. They plant fields with corn. They plant beans that grow up the corn stalks as trestles, and they plant gourds or squash that surround with tendrils the area in which they're gardening and act as a weed suppressant. Once these plants have been planted, they can be left alone and they don't have to return until the harvest. So you have a seasonal round that takes native peoples across a landscape where they move between fish runs, hunting in the winter, hunting grounds in the winter where they're looking for elk, moose, caribou, deer, things like that, and then returning to home village areas where they have gardens that they planted and harvest. When that soil becomes exhausted, they simply move their agricultural fields to new locations. And again, they cycle through a landscape by moving to sources of seasonal abundance, times when fruits, animals, plants are abundant, and they move across that landscape where they recognize a relationship to land according to use rights. And those use rights are established by kinship, one village to another, intermarriages within villages that allow people to have right to hunting territories, landscapes, etc. The English, in contrast, imagine land as property and something that can be purchased and owned by an individual. And once they use that land, somebody establishes a farm, for example, they don't imagine that that land could ever be anything else but a farm. They fix it with fences and they create property. Thus, we have two land use systems that are going to come into contact. At the time of this first encounter, this isn't the case. We still have a lot of room for cooperation. But this will evolve into something where there are competing claims for landscape that put native peoples in the expanding population of English settlers at odds and put their lifestyles and ways of life at odds. In other words, as farms expand, they encroach on Indian hunting territories, Indian planting territories, they foul up streams and block fish runs. They create conflict as people essentially begin to struggle with one another for control of the landscape and the resources that make it possible to live on that landscape. This is, however, all to be understood within the context of the arrival of new peoples in native North America and how native peoples have adapted to them, how they first see opportunity and later come to find conflict. This is a sort of background for the class that materials that we'll be discussing this week. Thank you. Bye-bye.